Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Coaching Conversations. My name is Vanessa Fernandez and I'm the founder of the Enneagram Workshop. And I actually today want to do some definitions. So a lot of times when I'm doing teachings, and I've got one coming up this weekend on the Enneagram and transformation, how we use the Enneagram to transform, what that journey looks like, what you need to be aware of if you want to go on that journey, and just a bunch of coaching tips since I'm a coach at heart. But when I do these kinds of trainings, I use words that you may not know what the meaning of that is in the context of the Enneagram. So I'm going to define two terms, which is really going to turn into four terms eventually, but two terms that you need to know that you may not be familiar with, and it's ego and essence. Ego and essence are two words that we use in Enneagram world to describe a false self and a true self. So those are the four terms we're working with: ego, false self, essence, true self. And when we are looking at these terms, first of all, it's very important to say that neither are necessarily bad or good. It's just two different states of being, and each state of being has certain consequences, results when we stay in those states of being for a long period of time. So let's start with ego and false self. Ego and false self, I use those kind of interchangeably, and what that means is it's the self that we feel like we have to be to make our way in the world. It's a self that is not our true essence, but something that we have manufactured. Typically, this starts to happen when we're very young. Typically, this is something that as children we're responding to some sort of perceived lack in our growing up world. We call this the holding, right? And when we're newborns, infants, young children, even older children, the holding space that we developed within would have some sort of perceived lack. And so when we see that perceived lack, something inside of us decides that we need to manufacture some sort of armor, some sort of way of being in the world that allows us to survive. Survival instinct is one of those base instincts that we all have. And so that just kicks in subconsciously. Oftentimes we're not aware of it until, we become more self-aware. We start growing on this journey. And so ego and false self is a manufactured way of being in the world that results from a perceived lack in the world. And when I talk about ego, when I talk about our false self, it's a restricting sort of not very fluid. It's a rigid set of characteristics. It's a rigid set of seeing the world. Again, it's a way of seeing the world that perceives lack. It's a way of seeing the world that has a sense of fear, a sense of I'm not okay, this is not okay, you're not okay, we're not okay. And so now I need to manufacture something to make it okay. And so, oftentimes when we talk about our type being an unhealthy space or average space, sort of the lower ends of our type, we're talking about ego really being dominant, the false self really being dominant. Now, what I said at the beginning about neither of these two ways of being are necessarily good or bad, I say that because we needed our false self, we needed our ego, and sometimes we still do, to protect ourselves from where there is lack, to protect ourselves from situations, from environments. And then also sometimes we manufacture that ego even when we don't need to, because it's a perceived lack, not a genuine lack. So there's both of those components happening when we look at ego and why it came about and why it happens and why we have it with us. And it's something that protects us. That protection is beautiful and needed. And I never want any of us to look at the way that our ego manifests and feel ashamed or feel like it's something we need to do away with or get rid of. Ego is a beautiful thing that just protects who we think we are and who we think we need to be. And so if we want ego to start falling away, because like I said, it's a rigid structure, so it has certain consequences. To stay in ego for a long period of time will restrict our growth. It will have us operating at a half a half state of the fullness of humanity, the fullness of our human experience. It will limit us down to a very limited experience of the world if we stay in ego, because it's that rigid structure, because it's like a cast that protects us, but also reduces our ability to be in the world, our mobility, etc. So again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes we need that protection. It's just something that we can be mindful of for if and when we choose to try and expand beyond ego. We have to understand what it's there for. We have to understand that it's protecting us. We have to understand that it's something that developed subconsciously and oftentimes operates subconsciously. So knowing all of this allows us to kind of have compassion for our ego. It's our friend. It's our friend trying to keep us safe, and also can limit us. So now let's move into essence and true self. What does essence and true self means? That really is our innocence in one sense. That is the part of us that would be there if we felt completely and fully safe. If we didn't perceive any lack in the world, but the world was good and safe and abundant and provision and wholeness, right? When any of the perceived lacks kind of get pulled out of the way, what we come back down to is the essence and the true self of who we were intended to be. So essence is beautiful, and essence is something that we kind of would love. Essence is the expansiveness, right? Essence allows us to experience the fullness of our humanity. And again, if we use the cast illustration, essence is the arm underneath the cast. Essence is something that allows us to function and move and be in the world in a safe and whole experience, not a limited experience, but a whole experience. You can still operate in essence and have ego kind of limiting it. So those two don't necessarily, it's not one or the other. And then the more that we press into safety, the more that we press into and remind ourselves that we don't necessarily need to always be protected, that ego can start to fall away, then essence is that expansive, more full, more whole self embodiment that oftentimes we are longing for. We are longing for it. And there's a beautiful sort of chart that I found, and I will post that later this week, where it talks about what we long for, what each type longs for, and then kind of what we settle for. What we long for is our essence. And what we settle for is ego's protection, ego's half experience of what we long for. So if one's long to be perfect and good and right and moral and all of those things, then ego kind of comes in and says, well, let's just have order, right? If everything feels orderly and in order, then that's sort of like the best we can hope for, right? And ego is like that lack, scarcity. There's not enough. I perceive this lack. Let's protect ourselves. Let's operate in this half experience. And then essence is there's abundance and there's perfection and there's goodness and there's all of this beauty in the world. And so what would I really want? Who at the essence am I supposed to be? And that sometimes there's a struggle between the two, but sometimes they also work together. And then usually essence is what we long for and ego is what we settle for. So hopefully that helps you, as there's so much more to be said about ego and essence, and I'm going to be talking about that in my workshop here at the end of the week. You can go to the link in my bio to get tickets to this class, but at least that can give you sort of an understanding whenever I talk about ego and essence. Yes, there's sometimes competing energies, but not always. And it's not like ego's bad, essence is good. They're just both two different ways of experiencing the world. Both belong, both are needed, but there are consequences and ramifications when we choose to be in the different ways of being, depending on how we're feeling, how safe we're feeling, how secure we're feeling, how embodied we're feeling, right? Like there's ways to move in and out of each one. I'm going to talk about that in my workshop, and we'll definitely be continuing this conversation, but that is a quick definition of ego, false self, and essence, true self.